What if survival itself was the cruelest punishment? I once thought death was the end. A clean release, a final prayer whispered into the void. My name is Olrich Vayner, brother captain of the Iron Hammers, and I carried that name as a crown of iron. Rank meant duty. Duty meant sacrifice. And sacrifice, we believed, meant glory. I had lived my life by the creed that to fall in battle was the highest honor a space marine could ever know. To die with weapon in hand, to give one's final breath in service of the Emperor, was to earn immortality in the memory of the chapter. That was the truth I carried into every war zone, into every deployment, into every desperate clash where bolter shells rang like thunder across alien skies. But faith in glory is a fragile thing, brittle as glass when struck by reality. I believed, but belief can shatter. I remember Morak Prime, a world of choking smoke and mud blackened by the tread of orc boots. The sky burned green with their fire, the ground quaked beneath their charge. Our defensive lines crumbled under the relentless tide, their axes and hammers striking ceramite like rain upon steel. I led my brothers into the storm, bolter raised, battle hymns echoing in my throat, even as blood filled the air with the taste of rust and iron. I remember the warlord who towered over the rest, crude armor spiked with trophies, his voice a roar that shook the marrow of bone. I remember raising my power fist, the weight of it guided by centuries of training, and driving it into his skull, bone and brain, pulped beneath the strike. Victory should have been mine in that moment. The Emperor's justice, swift and absolute. But death does not come without a price, and the beast's final blow was that price. His hammer fell even as his corpse collapsed, and it found the small gap between armor and pack. I felt my spine crack like a dry branch beneath its weight. Pain, sharp and electric, flooded my body, then vanished as nerves went silent one by one. I could not feel my legs. I could not feel my hands. Darkness closed in, and for one brief heartbeat, I thought the end had come. Death should have followed swiftly. Death would have been a mercy. My last thought was of release, of surrender into silence, of joining my fallen brothers in the Emperor's embrace. But fate or cruelty had other designs. I awoke not to peace, but to ceremony. Not to rest, but to whispers of salvation, spoken in tones too heavy to be honest. The taste of blood was still in my mouth, but it was overlaid now with incense and oil. Ritual smoke curling around me like chains. I could hear voices chanting litanies I did not recognize, machine prayers that belonged not to chaplains, but to tech priests. I tried to move and felt nothing. I tried to breathe and found the air filtered, cold, metallic, heavy with the stench of sanctified oil. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The Space Marine does not fear death, but in that moment I feared life. I feared what it meant to have been torn from the Emperor's embrace, dragged back into a prison made of steel and ceremony. My mind still clung to the battlefield, still heard the cries of orcs, still smelled the burning of their bodies, still remembered the fracture of bone in my back. Yet all of that had been severed, replaced by this silence, this ritual, this mockery of salvation. There are fates worse than death, and mine had only just begun. His first awakening would reveal the true horror. What does it mean to wake and find your body replaced by steel? At first, there was only darkness, a suffocating silence, where I floated like a soul lost between worlds. I thought I had died, thought the Emperor had gathered me into his light. But when the silence broke, it was not the warmth of salvation that met me, only the mechanical whine of pumps and the hiss of fluid coursing through tubes. My eyes opened, or what I thought were my eyes, and vision came not as light through flesh, but as a stream of data. Sterile and sharp, colors too precise, edges too clean. I reached for my hands and felt nothing but the click of servos. The whir of motors aligning steel digits where once bone and blood had been. I tried to breathe, but air did not enter lungs. Instead, I heard the deep hum of life support, iron bellows pressing oxygen into scraps of ruined flesh, keeping what little remained of me alive inside this sarcophagus. I remembered fragments of a dream before waking. Flames of battle, the hammer that broke my spine, the fleeting mercy of death. But the dream was gone now, replaced by this nightmare of function. And then I heard his voice. Chaplain Morai, helm of bone looming above me, lenses glowing red like judgment itself. His words rolled heavy, measured like ritual. Brother Captain Vayner, you have been chosen for the highest honor. Your service to the Emperor continues. I tried to answer, but the sound that escaped was a grinding rasp, Vox machinery tearing the shape of my voice into something alien. What have you done to me? I asked, but even my own ears recoiled from the mechanical thunder. Morai's reply was calm, rehearsed, too practiced to be mercy. We have saved you. Your body was broken beyond the skill of any apothecary, but your spirit burned too bright to be lost. You are reborn in iron and adamantium. The word fell then. Dreadnought. It landed like an executioner's blade, cutting me off from what I had been. I had seen them before, towering engines of war striding across the battlefield, their steps shaking the earth, their cannons roaring death into the ranks of enemies. I had revered them, thought them immortal monuments to sacrifice. But now I understood. Their movements were heavy not with glory, but with grief. Their voices echoed not with strength, but with sorrow. The weight of eternity behind every word. They were not machines of honor. They were prisons for the half-dead. I tried to move, and my new limbs obeyed with mechanical precision. But the sensation was hollow. No heartbeat quickened, no muscles strained, only the cold obedience of hydraulics. For 3 days, Morai said, I had been unconscious. Surgery and ritual binding flesh to frame, spirit to machine. 3 days. Yet to me, it felt like centuries. The void of sleep stretching into infinity. Already despair clawed at me. I asked when I would sleep again, desperate for even the void. But Morai's silence told me more than words. He did not say never, but the hollow pause carried the truth. Rest would never come, only the endless cycle of waking and war. I realized then the cruelty buried inside the ritual. They called this salvation. They called this honor. But it was neither. It was a tomb, cold and eternal, where I would linger half alive until the chapter no longer had use for me. The incense still hung in the chamber, sweet and choking, trying to mask the sour stink of sacred oil. I could hear the faint scratching of quills on parchment as servitors recorded my rebirth, every detail cataloged not as tragedy, but as triumph. To them I was a relic, proof of devotion, not a prisoner screaming inside a coffin. The irony was crueler than any blade. What the chapter celebrated as eternal glory, I knew to be eternal entrapment. My body was gone. My name was hollow. My life was not mine anymore. I was reborn in iron, but I had become something less than living, something that should not be. His new form would soon be tested in battle. Can a machine still know the thrill of war? That was the question that echoed through what remained of my mind as the chaplains and tech marines sealed me into the drop pod for my first deployment since the day my flesh was taken. The chamber was small, built of iron and rivets, lit by the dim glow of status runes that blinked like the heartbeat I no longer possessed. Around me, my battle brothers went through rituals I had once known so well, checking their bolters, murmuring litanies of victory, tightening the straps of their armor. But I could not join them. Where once I would have touched the grip of my sidearm, feeling the blessed metal beneath my gloves, I now flexed a claw of ceramite and adamantium, listening to the grind of servos echo through the confined space. My prayers no longer came from lips, but from static carried by vox channels, cold and lifeless. The pod shook violently as we were fired into the void. And for a moment, I remembered the rush of anticipation that had once filled my twin hearts. But those hearts were gone, replaced by pumps and tubes that gave no surge of adrenaline, only a steady pulse of recycled fluid. The seconds dragged like hours in the blackness between stars. And in that span, I knew the dreadful silence of being half machine, half ghost. Impact followed, a deafening crash as retro thrusters burned, and the pod carved itself into the soil of the agri-world. The doors burst open with explosive force, and light poured in, filtered through dust and smoke. I lumbered forward, each step shaking the ground, the weight of my armored shell too great for anything but the earth itself to bear. Data streamed into my vision. Wind speed, atmospheric density, ranges to multiple targets. It was not the world I once knew through senses of flesh, but a cascade of numbers and signals. The orcs were waiting, bellowing their savage war cries, crude weapons raised high. I advanced with my brothers, but I was something other, something separate. Where they charged with bolters roaring, I simply unleashed the storm of my assault cannon. The sound was thunder, unending, a mechanical hymn to destruction, and the orcs were shredded like parchment before a flame. My power fist smashed through bone and iron alike, each blow reducing green flesh and scrap armor to ruin. I was death incarnate, a walking fortress of ceramite and steel, and for a brief span of hours, I felt the shadow of purpose. Yet even as the battlefield turned beneath me into a charnel ground of broken bodies and shattered war machines, I noticed what was absent. There was no rush of breath, no sweat running beneath armor, no strain of muscle as I struck. My body did not tire. My lungs did not ache. The sensations that had once defined combat were gone, replaced with data, recoil dampening, and targeting reticles shifting across my vision. I crushed a war boss beneath my fist, his skull exploding like fruit, and the orcs faltered as their leader fell. My brothers shouted victory cries, voices full of zeal, but mine emerged as a metallic growl, a sound that carried no joy. We pressed the attack, and the greenskins broke, scattering into the fields, leaving their dead in heaps. In that victory, I knew the terrible truth. The Emperor had been served, the mission fulfilled, but I remained unchanged. For a moment, I had tasted what it was to be the weapon they wanted, the wrath of the Imperium given form. Yet within me, the emptiness lingered. No cheer of triumph filled my chest, no laughter of comrades rang in my ears. Only the grinding of gears and the echo of my own voice repeating orders. When the last orc was slain, silence fell, broken only by the crackling of fire and the hiss of cooling barrels. My brothers raised their songs to the Emperor, but I was led away, placed back into the pod, my systems cycling down. As darkness came again, I understood. Battles may end, but for me, there would be no rest, only the endless prison of iron that waited for the next awakening. And so my mind sank once more into the hollow void, carrying not triumph, not joy, but the heavy knowledge that I was alive only to kill again. A relic given motion, a prisoner wrapped in steel. What kind of sleep offers no dreams, only silence? That was the truth I first learned when the drop pod carried me back to the strike cruiser and they sealed me away once more. My brothers were singing, their voices raised in hymns of triumph, their flesh warmed by victory and the afterglow of purpose. For them, sleep would mean barracks and prayer, stories retold, memories cherished. For me, there was no such comfort. They lowered me into my sarcophagus, connected the sacred cables, and one by one the runes dimmed until the chamber filled with nothing but the hum of cooling systems. That hum became the last sound I knew before even it slipped away into silence. It was not the silence of peace, not the soft embrace of rest, but the silence of the grave. Time did not move. There were no thoughts, no visions, no distant shores reached by dream. There was only the void, a hollow so complete that when I awoke again, I doubted whether I had ever existed in the first place. The Dreadnought's sleep was no gift. It was a mockery, a death that was never final, a coffin that kept its occupant shackled to unlife. I had envied my brothers when we stood vigil at their pyres, their bodies committed to flame, their souls released to the Emperor's care. They had ended, cleanly, with honor. I remained, hovering forever on the edge of ending, but never allowed to fall. Each cycle carved something from me. Each return to silence reminded me that this was not rest, but punishment. A ritual of vanishing and returning, vanishing and returning, until identity itself became fragile. I would remember battle, remember blood, remember the brief hours of clarity when the guns spoke and the enemy fell. But then the void would claim me again, and when I rose from it, I was less certain of who I had been before. My sarcophagus became both tomb and cradle, lowering me into darkness, raising me into carnage, repeating without end. The first time it happened, I thought I would go mad in that silence, straining for any fragment of memory or sensation to cling to. But there was nothing. No Emperor's vision, no whisper of machine spirit, no comforting dream of comrades past. Only blankness. It was in that blankness that the fear grew. If this was eternity, how long could any mind endure it? I had seen dreadnoughts in the fortress monastery, their forms standing silent for centuries, entombed yet still alive. I had once revered them, but now I understood. They were not guardians. They were prisoners, waiting for the next awakening that would tear them out of nothingness and hurl them once more into slaughter. After my first campaign ended and the void claimed me, I counted each second as if counting would anchor me, but even the concept of seconds dissolved. It was like drowning in still water that never moved, never ended. When the next awakening came, it was not relief I felt, but terror, because I knew the cycle would repeat and there was no escape. For my brothers, sleep was a reprieve. For me, it was the endless rehearsal of death denied. The hum of my life support was the sound of chains, and the silence that followed was the abyss itself. I had become immortal. But in that immortality, I had found a fate worse than death. And in the suffocating silence, I knew that the next time I woke, it would not be orcs awaiting me. It would be something darker, something cunning, something born of betrayal. Chaos was coming, and I would face it not as a man, but as a prisoner bound in iron. What if your enemy knew your thoughts because he once was you? That was the truth of chaos. The dreadful revelation that the traitor was not some alien mind, but a reflection twisted into something monstrous. When the warband emerged from the warp near our patrol routes, the pattern of their attacks struck me immediately. This was not the blind fury of orcs or the ravenous swarms of xenos. These warriors fought as we once did. Their ambushes unfolded at the very crossroads we would have chosen. Their counterattacks struck from angles we had drilled into memory as sacred geometry. They knew because they had once been us. And in every maneuver, I saw my own doctrines turned against me. The battlefield roared with bolter fire cracking through sanctified ruins, corrupted flamers spewing filth across carved scripture, and the guttural chants of warriors who had once prayed the same litanies I still carried. They struck at weaknesses they once endured, tore at habits they once shared. Each clash was a mockery, each strike an echo of loyalty long since betrayed. I advanced through the chaos, my steps pounding rubble into dust, my cannon sweeping traitor ranks in storms of explosive fire. Yet even as enemies fell, a shadow darker than all others approached. He came. The Chaos Dreadnought. His form was a mirror of mine, a sarcophagus of steel and binding, but corrupted until it bore screaming faces etched into rusted plates. His weapons fused with pale flesh, exhausts belched warp-tainted smoke, and the ground shook with every stride. We collided like mountains shattering, my fist against his claw, sparks falling like meteors into the dust. The shriek of servos drowned hymns of war, armor split, and stone cracked beneath our weight. Then came his voice, not solemn like the chaplain's, but through vox speakers corroded by centuries of heresy. "Do you see what you are, loyalist?" he spat. "A ghost in a shell, a soul in chains. You serve not the Emperor, but the machine that devoured you." His words pierced deeper than his talons. In them lay the terror I had buried, that I was nothing but a prisoner masquerading as a weapon. I pushed back, hydraulics groaning, pistons grinding, every movement a reminder that strength no longer came from flesh or blood. He laughed, a sound of static and madness. I roared back in defiance, seizing his head in my power fist and crushing until rusted metal folded and corrupted flesh tore. His vox screamed, then died into silence. The chaos lines faltered, my brothers surged, hymns of victory echoing over shattered ground. Yet I did not join their chorus. His taunt still rang. Ghost, chains, empty shell. I smelled burning ichor through clogged filters, tasted ozone in lifeless air, and replayed his words again and again in the coffin of my mind. I had destroyed him, but his voice endured. When the last traitors fled into the warp, my brothers sang praise, declaring loyalty proven and purity preserved. I remained silent, for doubt had already taken root. The war was won, but the greater battle had begun. Not against chaos outside, but against the whisper of corruption within. A whisper that would echo across centuries of hollow awakenings. And as silence closed around me once more in the aftermath, I realized the depth of that poison. For every hymn I did not sing, the memory of his laughter grew louder. For every triumph my brothers declared, the whisper of his accusation coiled tighter. The machine spirit within my sarcophagus hummed with duty, but I felt it as chains. The victory my chapter celebrated felt like ash, because within me I carried not only the Emperor's fire, but also the enemy's shadow. I wondered, with a dread I dared not speak, how many centuries of silence it would take before I too began to believe his words. And when the rites of victory were completed, I was escorted back to the cold chambers of the monastery, sealed once more within the sarcophagus that served as both prison and altar. My brothers prayed, their voices reverent, yet to me it was only an echo. In the darkness, I replayed the duel again and again, each detail sharpened, each sound magnified. The crushing of metal, the hiss of corrupted vox, the weight of his accusation. Outside, they believed the foe defeated. But within, I felt as though the true war had only just begun. In the stillness, I sensed that the words of the corrupted Dreadnought would follow me into every sleep, into every awakening, like a shadow etched into iron. How does it feel to envy the dead? That is the question that gnawed at me as I stood silent, towering above the gathered ranks of my brothers, my sarcophagus locked into place, my systems humming with the eternal rhythm of a machine that refused to release me. The funeral rites of the chapter were a sacred liturgy, each word heavy with centuries of tradition, each chant echoing through the vaulted halls like a river of memory. Incense rose in slow curls, heavy with the scent of sanctity, masking the sharp tang of burning promethium. Before us, pyres had been built high, each constructed with reverent precision. For upon them lay the broken bodies of my battle brothers, wrapped in shrouds marked with the sigils of the Emperor. The chapter master spoke, his voice low and resonant, carrying across the courtyard with the weight of command. These warriors have found their peace in the Emperor's embrace. Their duty is complete. Their watch has ended. The words were meant to console, to offer glory. But to me, they cut like blades. For I knew that unlike them, I would never end, never rest, never lay down my burden. I watched as the flames took hold, devouring flesh and armor alike, transmuting years of service into smoke that rose toward the heavens. The fire crackled, and in its sound, I thought I heard release, as though each spark carried a whisper of freedom, a sigh of relief. The younger Marines sang hymns of honor, their voices raw with grief, but also with pride, for they believed their fallen now dwelt in eternal peace. I felt no pride. I felt only envy. The dead had reached completion. Their names would be etched into the walls of remembrance, their deeds spoken of in reverent tones, and their souls released to whatever fate awaited them beyond mortal knowing. I alone remained bound. Bound not by oaths or faith, but by cables, pistons, and the unyielding decree that I must endure for as long as my chapter demanded. Their watch had ended. Mine had no end. The firelight reflected on my ceramite hull, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the living. Some of the younger Marines glanced at me, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. To them, I was a monument of duty, an ancient whose presence sanctified the ceremony. They could not know that within my armored frame, envy burned hotter than the pyres themselves. I envied the stillness of their faces, the finality of their closed eyes. I envied the certainty of their end. While they were sung to rest, I was condemned to witness eternity. Even the silence after the hymns ended became a torment. The Marines bowed their heads, the flames roared high, and the smoke rose to meet the night. My sensors tracked each ember, each rising particle of ash, as though hoping that I too might be carried upward, freed at last. But no freedom came. My core remained tethered to power. My breath was the hiss of recycled air. My heart was a machine. When the pyres burned low and only ash remained, the apothecaries moved forward, collecting gene seed with quiet, practiced hands. Even in death, my brothers served. Their legacy preserved in vials of sacred essence to seed the next generation. Their sacrifice would bring new life. I had no such legacy. I was neither alive nor dead, neither future nor past. I was simply a witness, an eternal shadow at the edge of every ritual, condemned to remember when others were allowed to rest. I felt the emptiness yawning inside me, wider and colder than any void of space. It was not just envy. It was despair. At last, the chapter master raised his hand, declaring the rites complete. The The living turned away, their heads still bowed, their voices hushed. They would mourn, then return to training, to duty, to the endless war. I too was taken away, but not to rest. I was escorted down into the fortress monastery, to the deep halls where the ancients lay, entombed between battles. The journey was a ritual in itself. Narrow corridors lit by flickering lumen strips, walls lined with inscriptions of names long dead. The clang of servitor footsteps echoing my own heavy tread. With each level descended, the world of the living grew fainter, and the world of silence pressed heavier. In the vast chamber below, rows of sarcophagi waited, some humming with faint power, others silent, their occupants finally released from the torment of waking. I was secured into my designated place, clamps locking into position, machine spirits whispering their endless prayers through cables and ports. Around me, the other dreadnoughts stirred in half-silence. Their voices carried through the vox channels like echoes in a tomb. One spoke, his tone metallic, but edged with something like memory. First funerals are the hardest, young brother. You still remember what it was like to be flesh. His words lingered, heavy, and I knew he spoke truth. Memory was both my curse and my link to what remained of myself. And as my systems began to cycle down, as the black tide of dreamless void approached once again, the last thought that passed through me was envy. Sharp and unrelenting, envy for the fallen who had been granted what I never would. What advice can the half-dead give the newly entombed? That question echoed inside me, when the chamber of the ancients filled my senses with its oppressive stillness. Rows upon rows of sarcophagi lined the hall, some humming with faint currents of power, others silent as stone, their occupants long gone to the peace that had been denied them in life. My system cycled down, but not before I heard a voice, metallic and weary, carried across the vox channel that linked us together. First battles are always the hardest, young brother, said ancient Gareth, his tone heavy with centuries of endurance. He had been entombed for over 400 years, a relic older than any living captain, a figure of reverence even among our chapter's leaders. His words rang with a strange mixture of solemn authority and fading warmth that only one who had endured beyond natural measure could wield. You still remember what it was to be flesh and blood, Gareth continued, his mechanical timbre rasping yet oddly calm. That memory cuts like a blade. It is both blessing and curse. I listened, the weight of his statement pressing upon what fragments of humanity still lingered within me. A blessing, because memory kept me tethered to who I had been. Brother Captain Olrich Vayner, who had led men into the fires of Morak Prime. A curse, because it sharpened the torment of my present, the prison of steel and circuitry that pulsed around me like a second skin. How do you bear it? I asked. My own voice grated through the vox, stripped of warmth, a grinding distortion of what had once commanded troops with pride and fire. The question was no idle curiosity. It was a plea. By forgetting, Gareth replied. Each time you wake, you will remember less. The laughter of comrades, the taste of air, the feel of blood pumping through your veins, these will fade like mist at dawn. What remains will be purpose, stripped of pain, stripped of distraction. It is the kindness of the machine spirit. Forgetting is how we endure. His words should have soothed, but instead they set something cold into my core. To forget was to survive, but to forget was also to die in pieces, to be dissolved until nothing remained but function. Was that the fate of all dreadnoughts? Was I to become a weapon that bore no memory of the man within, a soul emptied until only echo remained? Fear struck me then, more profound than any battle had ever inspired. I had faced orcs and chaos champions, felt my body broken and reforged in adamantium. But never had I feared as I did in that moment. To lose myself entirely, to surrender the last threads of Olrich Vayner, was a fate beyond death. Death at least was final, a release. But this was erosion without end. I felt the tremor of dread ripple through what was left of my flesh, though no one could see it within the iron tomb. Gareth's voice carried on, steady, almost resigned. You will come to welcome it, young one. The burden grows too heavy otherwise. In time, you will no longer envy the dead. You will simply cease to care. The words dug into me, planting a seed I could not uproot. Perhaps for Gareth they were truth, learned over centuries of hollow awakenings and fading sensations. But for me, they sounded like prophecy, one I could neither accept nor deny. Could I cling to myself against the tide of years? Or would I too dissolve into the machine's endless hum? Around me, the chamber dimmed, my systems folding into standby, the hiss of coolant filling the silence. Gareth's Vox channel faded as darkness closed in, his voice trailing into static. His final words haunted me. You still remember, and that is your pain. One day, you will not. Sleep claimed me, the dreamless void rushing in like a tide of iron and silence. When next I awoke, frost would coat my sarcophagus, and the name of Gareth would no longer answer on the Vox. He would be gone, at rest at last, leaving me alone with the fear that his prophecy was true. What happens when decades vanish in a blink? That is the truth of our existence, the curse of the entombed. I awoke not to the warmth of light nor the sound of familiar hymns, but to frost clinging to my sarcophagus, each crystal a reminder of years swallowed by silence. My sensors adjusted, groaning to life, and I reached for the Vox channel where Gareth had always answered. Static replied. The frequency that once carried his weary counsel was void. A servitor's monotone confirmed what I feared. Brother Ancient Gareth is at rest. Rest, the word struck like a blade. For me, awakening meant chains renewed. For him, the silence had at last become peace. Another voice rose in the chamber, deep and metallic. He has been gone for 37 years. I am Ancient Matthias. Welcome back, Brother Ulrich. 37 years. I had slept while brothers lived and died, while campaigns raged and ended, while generations of Marines rose in service. Time had passed without me, and I had been nothing but a silent coffin, waiting to be used again. My dread grew sharper than any enemy's blade. If 37 years could vanish in an instant, how many centuries would dissolve before I even noticed? How much of myself would remain when the world I once knew became dust? Matthias spoke of the years as if they were nothing. Wars have been fought. Brothers have fallen. Recruits fill their place. The Imperium endures. His voice was steady, resigned, the cadence of one who had long abandoned the counting of years. To him, the past was haze. The present, only duty. I wanted to ask about names, about faces, about the brothers who had marched beside me. But I knew the futility. Memory had slipped away not only from me, but from the chapter itself. Each generation buried the last under new scars, new banners, new dead. Summoned to battle once more, I lumbered forth, my weapons checked by chanting tech priests, my systems aligned with sacred machine rites. The enemy hardly mattered. Was it orcs again? Chaos? Eldar? Each foe blurred into the same. Screams drowned by fire, blood splattering on stone, bolter shells cracking through corrupted armor. The reports would list dates and names, but to me, they dissolved into one endless storm, indistinguishable waves of slaughter. My memories, once sharp with detail, began to blur like ink bleeding in water. I struggled to recall the sound of my own voice as a man, the laughter of squadmates, the taste of air unfiltered by machines. Each awakening stripped another layer away, leaving me thinner, hollower, until only duty bound me to form. In the aftermath of battle, I was returned again to silence, my sarcophagus sealed in the deep halls. Matthias's presence was steady, his voice an anchor in the sea of forgetting. "Do not fight the years, Ulrich," he said. "They will pass regardless. What remains is your service. That is what defines us now." His words offered no comfort. For to serve was to vanish piece by piece, to trade memory for obedience, humanity for persistence. The more wars I fought, the less I remembered why I fought them. 37 years had passed in a blink. But worse than lost time was the realization that memory itself was slipping away. Faces once dear grew hazy. Victories I had bled for faded into sterile records. Even my own name began to feel foreign, a title applied to a machine rather than a man. I was becoming what I feared most, a weapon that thought without remembering, a shell that moved without truly living. As sleep reclaimed me again, the dread was not of death, but of forgetting. And in that darkness, I wondered what part of me would remain when next I awoke. Or if I would even know myself at all. Can you still be yourself when your memories feel borrowed? That was the question that consumed me when, during a brief awakening between campaigns, I was permitted access to the chapter's archives. I had asked, almost demanded, to see the records of Brother Captain Olrich Vayner, the man whose name I bore, the warrior who had once led squads into glory. The librarians, ever obedient, unlocked the data vaults and displayed the chronicles across scrolling hololiths. There it was, page after page of victories, commendations, and reports. Olrich Vayner, brother captain of the Iron Hammers, decorated, fierce, unyielding. Yet as I studied the lines, I felt nothing of recognition. It was like reading the life of a stranger, words etched in stone that spoke not to me, but to someone long since gone. The dates aligned with my own existence. The campaigns listed were those I remembered in outline. The names of comrades, the worlds fought over, the enemies slain, all correct, all precise, yet hollow, as though viewed through glass. My mind strained to connect with the man described, but the threads snapped every time I reached for them. I remembered Morak Prime. I remembered the final blow that broke my spine. I remembered the searing agony of rebirth into steel. But the man before that, his voice, his laughter, the fire in his blood, had slipped beyond my grasp. I read about charges led with valor, about speeches that had rallied brothers on the brink of despair, about victories carved into legend. Yet when I tried to summon the sound of those words from my own mind, silence answered. It was as though I studied a hero who had died long ago, whose deeds lived on only in records and rumor. Could I claim to be him if I no longer felt his spirit? Or was I merely a machine that had inherited his name like a relic worn by the unworthy? The realization grew heavier with each line I read. The archives celebrated a man of flesh, of conviction, of humanity. I was not that man. My body was a sarcophagus of ceramite. My voice was a rasp of gears and static. My emotions were echoes at best, faint shadows of feelings once sharp and real. The more I searched the records, the more the fracture widened. I was both Olrich Vayner and not him at all. I carried his memories, but they felt like recordings played on damaged circuits. They belonged to someone else, someone I could study, but never truly become again. I remembered leading squads, but when I tried to recall the warmth of brotherhood, all I could summon were tactical positions and casualty lists. I remembered victories, but without triumph. Only data entries marking efficiency. The horror struck deeper than any wound I had endured. That Olrich Vayner had indeed died on Morak Prime, and what survived was only a remnant. A construct made of fragments and steel, wearing his name like an ill-fitting garment. I felt the weight of that truth pressing down on me in the silence of the archives. The other Marines spoke of me with reverence, called me ancient, hailed me as the same hero I once had been. But inside, I knew I was not that man. I was his shadow, his ghost bound in iron. To hear his name spoken was to feel estrangement, as if it belonged to another carved into legend, while I remained an imposter entombed. The mini-climax of my despair came when I stared upon a mural painted centuries ago, depicting Brother Captain Olrich leading a charge through fire and ruin, his face noble, his eyes alight with the Emperor's fire. I saw that man, recognized every feature, but could not feel him within myself. He was gone. I was stranger to myself, a relic that remembered without truly belonging. And in that fracture, I felt the identity of machine begin to eclipse the memory of man. The resolution was no peace, only a deeper fracture. I left the archives, my systems groaning as I was returned to the vaults below, and I felt as though I walked not into silence, but into a tomb of truth. I was no longer Ulrich, not truly. I was something else, something that bore his name, but not his spirit. And as the summons to war rang once more, I knew that the battlefield ahead would test this fracture further, would expose how much of me was still man and how much was only machine. What happens when faith itself is corrupted? That question defined the campaign of Vayner, a shrine world once radiant with hymns and holy fire, now drowned beneath the stench of chaos. I awoke to the summons of war and found myself deployed among younger Marines whose faces still bore the softness of youth. Eyes bright with conviction, voices eager to sing the Emperor's praises even as they prepared for slaughter. I watched them in silence, my sarcophagus groaning as I moved forward, and already I felt the first fracture of distance between their zeal and my hollow endurance. The shrines of Vayner stood shattered, their once gilded arches smeared with blood and filth, their sacred icons twisted into grotesque parodies by the cults of the dark gods. I scanned frescoes where once the Emperor's light was painted, now defaced with runes that crawled like wounds across stone. The air stank of burned incense mingled with rotting flesh. Hymns of chaos chanted in blasphemous inversion of prayers I once knew. The Marines around me recoiled at the desecration, their voices rising in vows of vengeance. But I felt nothing stir within. Where their faith was tested and burned hotter, mine was muted, subdued, almost extinguished. The cultists attacked in waves, a tide of frenzied bodies clothed in rags and daubed with unholy marks, their voices screaming praises to false gods. My assault cannon roared, tearing them apart in bursts of explosive fire, and my power fist crushed those who dared approach. Around me, the younger Marines fought desperately, bolters thundering, chainswords hacking through corrupted flesh. Some faltered, their courage shaken by the sight of their sacred world profaned. Yet still they pressed on with zeal. I observed their valor as one might observe a ritual long familiar, yet without connection. They bled, they shouted, they wept with fury at the sacrilege. I felt only the grinding of gears, the hiss of hydraulics, the cold efficiency of a machine purging a problem. Even as chaos fire burned across my armor and cultists hurled themselves against me, I felt no surge of fear, no thrill of battle, no righteous fire. Only emptiness. The mini-climax came in the heart of the Grand Cathedral, where chaos had enthroned its corruption. The altar, once adorned with relics of saints, had been gutted and replaced with a mound of corpses, their faces contorted into frozen hymns of agony. The stained glass that once cast holy light was shattered, shards scattered across the floor like broken faith. The younger Marines entered before me and fell to their knees in grief, some trembling at the sight, others lifting their voices in defiant hymns, trying to drown out the whispers of corruption that echoed in the desecrated chamber. I advanced through the wreckage, my massive frame crushing shattered glass beneath my feet, and felt nothing. The horror did not touch me, because the part of me that once cared for beauty, for sanctity, for holiness, had been carved away long ago. Where my brothers struggled against despair, I was immune, not through strength of spirit, but through absence of it. I realized then the irony of my existence. The cultists' whispers reached for the hearts of the faithful, twisting hope into despair, turning devotion into mockery. But I had no heart left to twist. My humanity had been hollowed out until there was nothing left for chaos to corrupt. The young Marines trembled under the psychic weight of the blasphemies, their faith both shield and target. I stood beside them, untouched, not by divine will, but by loss. I had nothing left to give to the Emperor, and therefore nothing the dark gods could claim. My immunity was not sanctity, but vacancy. When the cathedral finally burned, when the altar of corpses was reduced to ash and the banners of chaos torn down, the Marines wept with relief, their hymns of victory rising ragged but proud. They had survived a trial of faith. They would remember Vayner as the battle that tested and hardened them. For me, it was another campaign added to the blur, another ruin processed, another desecration observed without feeling. Where they emerged tempered, I remained unmoved. The numbness spread deeper, the detachment stronger, until I felt more tomb than warrior, more machine than ancient. As the campaign ended, and I was led once more into silence, how I understood the change with clarity. The corruption of Vayner had been terrible, yet it had not scarred me. Nothing could scar me anymore, because nothing could reach me. My brothers thought it strength. They called me unshakable, a pillar of the Emperor's will. They did not see the truth, that my detachment was not resilience, but the hollowing of a man who had already ceased to be. The siege had ended, but what remained was the certainty that numbness had become my shield, and that shield would never be lifted again. What if your past self returned to accuse you? That question became a vision that haunted me in the stillness between wars, when the void was not as empty as it should have been. I dreamed, though dreams were said to be impossible in the tomb of iron. Yet, in the blackness, I found myself not as the towering husk I had become, but standing on two legs, clad in the armor of a captain, my face unscarred, my breath free of machines. Before me was the battlefield of Morak Prime, frozen in a moment of ruin, smoke rising in unmoving pillars, bolter shells suspended in the air like beads of glass. Across that dead stillness walked another figure, and when he drew near, I saw his face was my own. Not the withered, half-remembered self, but the man in his prime. Olrich Vayner, alive, human, whole. His eyes burned with recognition, but also with judgment, and I felt the weight of being measured by the man I once was. "You are not me," he said, voice firm, carrying the authority I once commanded without effort. "You wear my name, but you do not carry my soul. You are a husk. You are dying by degrees. His words struck harder than any chaos blade, for they were not lies from an enemy, but truth from myself, sharpened and undeniable. I tried to answer, to insist that I still served, that I still fought in the Emperor's name, that purpose remained. But his eyes pierced deeper, cutting through excuses, and he shook his head. Service without self is hollow. Victory without memory is meaningless. You endure, but you do not live. That is not sacrifice. That is abandonment. Around us, the battlefield shifted, the frozen ruin beginning to move again. I saw the younger Marines I once led. Their faces turned to me for courage, their shouts echoing with faith. Yet when they looked upon me in this vision, their eyes widened not with loyalty but with fear. They saw me as the Dreadnought, towering and inhuman. My fists dripping with oil instead of blood, my voice nothing but static and command protocols. I turned back to the man I once was, and his expression was grief. "You have lost them," he whispered. "You have lost me. Piece by piece, you let go of what made you alive, until all that remains is the echo of duty." The accusation rose to a climax when he stepped closer, his breath hot and real upon my face, his hand gripping my shoulder with the strength of flesh. "Do you think this is immortality? It is not. It is erosion. It is the death of man stretched over centuries. Better to have fallen with honor than to linger like this. Chained to iron, forgetting even the warmth of being." His words carved into me with the precision of blades, because they came not from doubt or heresy, but from the truth of my own memory. He was what I had been, and I was what he feared to become. I staggered in the dream, my machine-laden limbs suddenly heavy again, the vision of my younger self blazing brighter with each heartbeat. Yet even in his accusation, there was something else, a warning, perhaps even a plea. "Remember," he said. "Remember what it was to be me. Hold it even as it fades, or you will be nothing but steel and silence." His hand released my shoulder, and as he stepped back, the battlefield dissolved, the smoke scattering into the void, the faces of my men fading into static, and the voice of the man I once was echoing one last time. "Do not forget, Olrich. Do not forget." Then I awoke, or thought I did. The sarcophagus around me still, the machine spirit humming, the silence absolute. Had it been a dream? Or had some fragment of my soul risen from the depths to confront me? I could not tell. All I knew was that the words lingered like fire etched into iron, dying by degrees. Remember or be nothing. The next awakening would test whether I had heeded the warning, or whether I was already too far gone to care. What kind of enemy awaits in the dark belly of a drifting hulk? The question was not merely tactical, not simply a calculation of biomass, weaponry, or defenses. It was a question of the unknown, the unfathomable, the chaos that lay at the heart of every derelict spewed forth from the warp. As our boarding torpedo hammered its way into the twisted carcass of fused starships, I felt the young Marines around me shifting in their restraints. The hiss of their armor systems, the quiet prayers murmured over Vox channels. I studied their faces through my sensors, committing them to memory, though I knew those memories would dissolve into haze. They were so young, bright eyes hardened by training, but still carrying the unshaken light of faith. The hull breached with a thunderclap, molten metal dripping from the edges of the rupture as the torpedo's clamps locked in place. Doors blew open, and we advanced into a corridor warped beyond recognition. Once it had been the spinal hallway of an Imperial cruiser, now twisted bulkheads bent at impossible angles, deck plates groaning under the weight of centuries. Air so thick with rot that even my mechanical filters flared with alarm. My optical sensors adjusted to the gloom. registering faint glimmers of motion. Shadows that slithered just out of reach. Contacts ahead. One Marine called, Auspex readings jagged, confused, life signs but wrong, pulsing and fading as though the very act of perception made them unstable. I moved to the front, assault cannon primed, power fist flexing, and I gave the only order that could be given in such a place. Advance, cleanse, burn. The first shapes shambled into view, men and women who had once been imperial citizens, now warped, flesh bloated, bone twisted into claws, faces stretched in grotesque parodies of prayer and scream. They lurched toward us with movements more instinct than will, and my weapon roared. The assault cannon tore them apart, shell after shell, ripping bodies into fragments, the thunder filling the confined passage until it seemed the Hulk itself screamed. The Marines fought bravely at my flanks, bolters barking, chainswords snarling. But for every abomination that fell, 2 more pressed forward. We carved a path, our fire reducing the corridor to a charnel house of burning meat and ruptured metal. Yet as I advanced, I studied their faces. The eyes of the warp touched, and some part of me, deep and almost forgotten, stirred with pity. These had been victims, prayers twisted against their will. But the feeling passed like smoke, leaving only cold efficiency. Eliminate, secure, move forward. In the madness of that labyrinth, we fought horrors without name. Creatures of liquid shadow, entities that laughed with the voices of children as they struck with claws of bone. But it was not these that scarred deepest. It was what befell Brother Lucian. He was young, barely out of the scout company, eager, resolute. In the gloom of a fractured chapel, he fought beside me when the floor ruptured and something surged forth. It was fluid, metallic, writhing with malice, its touch corrupting all it grazed. Lucian's pauldron blackened, spines erupting where once there was polished ceramite, his arm twisting under the corruption's influence. He screamed, and in that scream was the terror of a soul hearing whispers from the warp. I struck the creature down, my fist pulverizing it, my flamer bathing the remnants. But it was too late. Lucian fell to his knees, armor splitting as veins of black crawled across his flesh. His voice came over Vox, ragged, desperate. Ancient One, end this. I feel it changing me. I hear them. I hear the voices. Kill me before I become their thrall. His words should have broken me, but they did not. In another life, I would have wept. Felt the crushing sorrow of extinguishing a spark of loyalty. Now there was only calculation, compromised asset, potential contagion, risk of spreading corruption. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot yet steady, and I gave him the only mercy I could. My power fist came down, swift, decisive. His skull crumpled like parchment, silence replacing his scream. Gene seed was recovered, as doctrine demanded, his name to be written on scrolls. But in me there was nothing. No grief, no rage, not even the hollow echo of mourning. Only acknowledgement. The threat had been neutralized. The Marines around me did not see my emptiness. They saw duty, courage, mercy. They saw a warrior who had saved them from the shame of fighting a brother twisted by corruption. They raised their voices in hymns, even as blood steamed on the deck. But I stood still, a tomb of steel, colder than the void around us. We pressed on through the Hulk's intestines, chamber after chamber filled with nightmares, the stench of incense warped into rot, the bones of pilgrims fused into walls. Every battle blurred, every victory shallow, every face one more entry in the ledgers of the dead. But the killing of Lucian remained, not as grief, but as evidence. Whatever humanity I had clung to was fading. I could kill a brother and feel nothing. And that was more terrifying than the warp. As the campaign dragged on, I found myself less shaken by the horrors we faced than by the realization that I no longer feared them. The young Marines crossed themselves before defiled shrines, muttered prayers louder when chants of chaos echoed. I, meanwhile, cataloged angles of fire, structural weaknesses, kill zones. Faith and fear were gone. Only procedure remained. When the Hulk's engines finally burned and we withdrew to the waiting transports, I carried no weight of sorrow, only silence. Brother Lucien was gone, and I could not mourn. The horror was not his death, but my inability to feel it. In that silence, I understood the truth. Even pity had been stripped away. Horror would deepen. For if pity was gone, what remained to make me human? What if the enemy claimed you were already theirs? The question sank deep into me as we pushed into the very heart of the Space Hulk, a place where light seemed to recoil, where even the auspex flickered with hesitation, as if unwilling to reveal what lurked within. The core had once been the bridge of a battleship, but centuries of warp exposure had twisted it into a cathedral of nightmares. Bulkheads warped into arches that bent like ribs, console banks fused into grotesque altars, and every surface pulsed faintly as though alive. My sensors strained, picking up life signs, but so distorted they blurred into static. A haze of existence, half in this realm and half in another. We entered cautiously, bolters raised, prayers whispered, the young Marine's voices tremulous yet firm. At the center of the chamber stood something that might have once been human, but had since grown into a form that defied reason, towering yet amorphous, its edges flickering, its presence oppressive. It spoke not with a single mouth, but with a chorus of voices, whispers and screams overlapping. "Welcome, servants of the false emperor," it said, each word vibrating in the marrow of my brothers, each syllable corroding faith. "Come closer and see the truth that lies beyond your delusions." The Marines faltered, their breathing ragged, one clutching his chest as though his hearts were being gripped by unseen claws. Their faith was tested, stretched thin against this assault of pure blasphemy. But I felt nothing. My targeting systems locked on with cold precision, distance, angle, probability of successful elimination. To me, the entity was not temptation or terror, but merely a target to be erased. It noticed, its myriad voices twisted into laughter. "And here is the greatest of my amusements," it crooned, focusing on me. "The warrior entombed, the ghost bound in a shell. You do not serve the Emperor. You serve the machine. You are already ours." The words echoed like oil poured into cracks, seeping deep. Around me, the Marines trembled, hands tightening on weapons, their faith warring with despair. But I answered not with prayer nor denial, but with fire. My assault cannon roared, the chamber thundered, and shells tore into the entity. Its form convulsed, splinters of unnatural matter spraying in impossible directions, shards of concept and flesh dissolving in sparks of unlight. Still it laughed, even as my shells shattered its body, even as ichor that was not blood stained the ground. The laughter persisted. "Yes," it hissed through voices breaking apart. "Kill me, Dreadnought, weapon, husk. Every shot, every strike proves my words. You are empty. You are hollow. We need do nothing but wait." The Marines rallied at my side, bolters spitting, chants rising louder to drown the cacophony, yet I could see in their eyes the doubt planted. The thing finally collapsed, its form unraveling into smoke that smelt of iron and rot, its essence drawn screaming back into the warp. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of cooling barrels, the ragged breathing of those who had stood firm. Victory had been won, abomination was gone. But in the hollow of that chamber, in the smoldering ruins of our triumph, the laughter lingered, not in sound, but in thought. A resonance that repeated in my mind like an unwanted echo. Empty, hollow, already theirs. My brothers sang hymns of deliverance, voices hoarse but strong, their faith rekindled by the sight of the enemy undone. Yet within me, there was no song, only the repeated whisper of the mockery. Was it right? Had I crossed so far into steel and code that I was beyond temptation, not because of strength, but because of absence? I turned from the chamber, leading the squad out. Massive steps echoing like drums of war, each one measured and unflinching. But in the silence between, in the void of what should have been relief, the question gnawed. Was I truly already lost, as the demon claimed, already theirs in emptiness? A hollow vessel where humanity had once dwelt? The laughter answered in the dark, though no sound remained. Can memory alone be enough to fight for? The question burned in me as alarms shrieked through the fortress monastery, klaxons echoing like a dirge of desperation. Tech marines swarmed my sarcophagus, voices sharp with hurried litanies, cables hissing, seals clamping shut. Chaplains moved among them, their skull-faced masks gleaming, prayers rasped in urgency rather than ceremony. A chaos fleet had erupted from the warp, led by the traitor warband called the Iron Skulls, and they came not as raiders, but as executioners. Their target was not simply territory, not simply slaughter, but our monastery itself, our relics, our very gene seed. The bastion of the Iron Hammers, sacred for 10 millennia, shuddered under the first bombardments, and I felt the vibrations through the steel of my tomb. I was deployed to the central courtyard, the choke point that would decide whether the enemy would breach the inner sanctum. As the locks disengaged and I strode into the open air, I looked upon my home with eyes that seemed new. Towering walls carved with oaths, spires crowned with statues of martyrs, stone blackened by centuries of incense and fire. This was more than fortress. It was memory, legacy, the very soul of my chapter. For the first time in centuries, I felt something stir. Something that might have been called love. The enemy came in a tide of black and crimson armor, bolters blazing, banners of blasphemy whipping in the poisoned wind. At their head walked the Ravager, a figure clad in Terminator plate, presence so immense that even the air thickened with his malice. Once he had been a chapter master, a paragon of tactical genius. Now corruption flowed from him like a river of oil, staining ground and sky. His voice, magnified by vox and warp in unison, carried across the courtyard like a hammer. "So," he bellowed, "the famous ancient Olrich finally awakens. Tell me, machine ghost, do you even remember what it felt like to be alive?" His words struck me deeper than the artillery pounding the walls. They were the echo of the dream where my past self had accused me, the warning that memory was slipping away. I could have answered with silence, with cold calculation, as I had for so long. But instead, something within me chose differently. "I remember enough," I growled. And for the first time in centuries, I meant it. I charged forward, assault cannon roaring, power fist clenched with fury. The Ravager met me in the ruins of a shrine, his demon blade shrieking with voices of the damned as it crashed against my armored bulk. Sparks flew like meteors, steel rang like bells of doom, every impact a clash of faith and blasphemy. The Chaos Marines howled, my brothers countered with hymns, and still we fought. Two titans locked in single combat, the battle pivoting on our struggle. He was immense. Every swing of his blade carried the weight of centuries of hatred. Every step crushed stone into dust. But I was not merely steel, not merely programming. With each strike, I recalled what it meant to fight for more than victory. I remembered faces of brothers who had stood beside me. I remembered laughter, prayer, blood spilled not as data, but as sacrifice. Passion surged where once there had been void, and with it came strength no machine could replicate. The Ravager snarled, voice dripping venom. "You are dead already. You fight for nothing." I locked weapons with him, servo motors screaming, hydraulics threatening rupture. "Perhaps," I answered, and I felt something in me twist into what might have been a smile. But that memory is enough. I broke his guard with a maneuver I had not used in centuries. A strike born not of calculation, but of instinct. My power fist drove through his armor, crushing the corrupted flesh beneath. The Ravager's roar turned to a gurgle, his blade falling from fingers warped and trembling. He collapsed in ruin, and as his corrupted form stilled, his warband faltered. Their devotion cracked, their charge wavered. The iron hammers pressed forward, bolters thundering, chainswords howling, driving the enemy back into smoke and fire. Victory was ours, the monastery saved, the relics untouched. Around me, brothers raised their voices in praise, hymns rising over the wreckage. But within me, a deeper victory resounded. For the first time in centuries, I had not fought as a machine fulfilling its programming, but as a man choosing to fight. I looked upon my brothers, their faces weary, bloodied, yet filled with faith, and I committed them to memory, not as statistics, but as individuals worthy of remembrance. In choosing to remember, I had chosen to feel, and in feeling, I had reclaimed something long thought lost. Meaning had returned, not from victory itself, but from remembrance. And in that remembrance, humanity endured. What does it mean to feel pride again after centuries of numbness? The question lingered as silence fell over the monastery courtyard, broken only by the clatter of boulder shells cooling on stone and the groans of the wounded. The Ravager lay ruined at my feet, his once commanding form reduced to a shattered husk. And yet, it was not his fall that weighed most upon me. It was the faces of my brothers, smeared with blood and ash, eyes blazing with faith even as their bodies faltered. For the first time in longer than I could measure, I looked upon them not as figures to be catalogued, not as data in a combat log, but as men, warriors, brothers bound to me by more than doctrine. They approached with reverence, calling me ancient, their voices heavy with awe. But I no longer wanted their awe. I wanted to know them. Brother Captain Thane, who had held the eastern wall against impossible odds. His armor cracked, but his spirit unbroken. Sergeant Maxim, whose cunning maneuvers turned the tide when defeat loomed darkest. Chaplain Morai, whose words lifted hearts even as his throat bled from shouting prayers over the roar of chaos. I committed their names, their deeds, to the fragile organic memory I still possessed, carving them into my soul as surely as their names would be etched upon the chapter rolls. It was not efficiency. It was choice. In that choice, I felt something stir. Pride, fragile and trembling, yet real. As days passed and the wounded were tended, I remained awake longer than usual, a sentinel among men who had long looked at me as more relic than brother. They sought my counsel, not only for tactics, but for wisdom, for guidance that went beyond firing solutions and stratagems. And I gave it, not as a machine-spitting doctrine, but as one who remembered what it meant to be human. I told them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the defiance of it. I told them that to mourn was not weakness, but proof that their hearts had not turned to stone. I told them that their bond to each other was what made their service holy. They listened, not with the blind obedience given to a weapon, but with the respect given to one who had chosen to remember. For me, each conversation was an act of defiance against the erosion of my soul. Yet pride carried grief with it. When a young assault marine named Corvin thanked me for saving his life during the campaign, I felt something I had not known in centuries, a warmth like paternal pride. But I also knew the truth. He would one day die, and his name would join the endless litany of the fallen. The thought should have crushed me. Instead, it strengthened my resolve. If he was to be remembered, then I would remember. Not as a record, but as a man holding onto the last threads of his humanity. Pride and grief intertwined, binding me more firmly to what I was choosing to reclaim. I knew my time was waning. The organic remnants of my body decayed further with each awakening, the weight of centuries pressing closer. But rather than surrender to despair, I clung harder to memory. I chose to inscribe faces, words, and deeds into the fragile chambers of flesh that still resisted the tide of steel. I knew they would fade, as Gareth's had faded, as Lucian's had blurred. But even so, I fought to keep them alive within me. That was my rebellion. That was my humanity. And so, in the shadow of victory and the promise of further wars, I felt something I had thought lost forever. I felt pride. Not in myself, not in the machine I had become, but in them, in the brothers who carried the light of the Emperor into the void. Their triumphs were mine to witness, their sorrows mine to share, their humanity mine to guard. I chose to hold that pride, to guard it as jealously as any relic, for it proved that I was still more than weapon, still more than husk. It proved that I could still feel. The battle with the Ravager had shown me that memory could be enough to fight for. But now I knew something deeper. Memory alone was fragile, but choosing to remember, choosing to feel, that was strength. My end was approaching, each slumber longer, each awakening more difficult. But as long as I could still choose, I would choose humanity. For in that choice lay the only victory that mattered. How does a machine die when its human soul chooses to let go? The question hummed in the silence of my tomb as I felt systems flicker. Life support faltering, warning runes cascading like falling stars across my vision. Centuries of service had corroded the remnants of flesh within me. Organs worn to the edge, neural connections frayed by time and strain. I had endured more campaigns than I could number, faced horrors that would have broken worlds. And yet the final enemy was not chaos or Xenos, but inevitability. My body was dying, the last vestiges of humanity within my sarcophagus withering like leaves in winter. For the first time, I did not resist. There was no fear, no anger, only acceptance. Where once the void of standby had been torment, now it seemed a promise of release. I summoned my remaining strength to the Vox, to the systems that still obeyed me. My voice, once thunder, now came as a rasp through static. But it was enough. I began to speak, not to my brothers standing vigil outside, not to chaplains who would sing my dirge, but to those yet unborn, warriors who would one day inherit the curse and the glory of our chapter. Remember, I said, each word forced from faltering lungs, each syllable hammered into the stone of memory. Remember not only the victories, not only the doctrines. Remember the men beside you. Remember their faces, their laughter, their sacrifice. Hold them in your hearts, for that is what makes you more than weapons. The machine hissed, fluid pumps failing, circuits dimming. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. Yet I forced the words through. Do not surrender your humanity, for it is the Emperor's greatest gift. Even in steel, even in silence, choose to remember, choose to feel. For that choice is the only shield against the emptiness. The recording sealed itself within the archives of the chapter, encrypted, blessed, carried by servitors who would one day place it in the Hall of Ancients. I felt the ritual prayers begin outside. The low voices of brothers chanting as the chaplain prepared the rites of final interment. Incense smoke drifted in, the faint scent reaching even my ruined sensors. I thought of Gareth, of Lucian, of Matthias, of all who had come and gone while I lingered. I thought of the Ravager, crushed beneath my fist, and of the pride I had reclaimed in choosing to remember. For a moment, they were all there with me, a choir of memory, a chorus of humanity. Pride swelled in the ruins of my chest, grief entwined with it. But peace overshadowed both. The end was not darkness, but completion. The machine that had been my prison was now my coffin, and I accepted it willingly. Power drained, hydraulics hissed their last, vision dimmed into night. My final thought was not of battle, nor of duty, but of faces, voices, the fragile threads of humanity I had chosen to guard. I let them go, not into oblivion, but into legacy. Outside, the chapters sang hymns as my tomb was carried into the catacombs, placed among the honored dead. The chaplain's voice intoned of sacrifice, of duty eternal, of faith unbroken. Yet hidden within the stone, within the recording I had left, was a softer truth, that even in the grim darkness, memory could be light. My name would be written in the rolls, my deeds carved upon walls. But it was not those that mattered. What mattered was the seed of hope I left behind. The reminder that even a Dreadnought, cursed and entombed, could choose humanity until the end. And in that choice, I found peace. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even a prison of steel can yield a final message of hope.